Good afternoon or good morning, depending on what side of the ocean are you now. So I'm Silvano, and with Luca Oliva and Caterina Del Sordo, I'm one of the organizers of this seminar series devoted to Carnap's logic construction of the word, also known as the Aufbau. This series of meetings investigates Carnap work from different perspectives with the help of some of the prominent scholars in the field of Carnapian studies. And before we begin this meeting, I would like to remind you that it has been recorded. The recording, along with others from this series, will soon be available as part of the collection on a dedicated website. The format of the meeting includes a presentation of about 1 hour, followed by a 10 minutes break. After the break, we will have time for questions and answers. This is the 5th meeting of this year, and it is my great pleasure to introduce you Professor Richard Creath as the today's speaker. Professor Creath is President, Professor, and Program Director at the Arizona State University, and he brings exceptional expertise in the history of science and the philosophy of science. In addition to his formal roles, Professor Creath served as curator of the Rudolf Carnap collection at the University of Pittsburgh and as the general editor of Carnap's collected works. His scholarship offers a deep and thoughtful exploration of the evolution of philosophy of scientific knowledge, particularly through the historical and philosophical dialogue between Carnap and Quine. Professor Creath provided insightful and continued to dominate current discussion in the philosophy of knowledge around these topics. Please join me in welcoming Professor Richard Creath, and Professor, the virtual floor is now yours, please.
Thank you. Those are very kind words indeed. I hope I can live up to them. My title is From the Project of the Aufbau to Tolerance, and all of the words in that title are going to play a role. Please change the slide. Before I begin my official remarks, I want to thank the speakers, the organizers as a whole of the webinar series, especially Caterina and Luca, but of course Silvano as well. All the other speakers, all those who are attending, I've learned really a great deal from your talks and questions. I also want to take a moment to remember Michael Friedman, who died on March 24th. I must admit that I am still shaken by the loss. He was a personal friend and a help when I needed it most. But more than that, he made profound and far-reaching contributions to Carnap studies, to Kant scholarship, to the history and philosophy of science, and to philosophy more generally. And it was he and Alan who roused me from my dogmatic slumbers about the Aufbau. We shall miss him. Wilfrid Sellars began his autobiographical reflections with the following story, and I'm quoting. One day in the late 1940s, Robert Turnbull and I drove to the Minneapolis airport to meet Rudolf Carnap, who was coming to speak to the Graduate Philosophy Club and to visit his good friend Herbert Feigl. At the time, I was discussing his Logische Aufbau in my seminar in philosophical analysis, and we had scarcely settled in the car for the return journey when I began to bombard my captive audience with questions. I vividly remember that his first reaction was to expostulate, but that book was written by my grandfather. Please change the slide. What I want to argue, no, not yet, go back one. Okay, thank you. Yes, that one. What I want to argue today is that Carnap's later work inherited more from his grandfather than is sometimes admitted. That conclusion is one that I would not fully have believed even 5 or 10 years ago. I suspect that everyone but me knew it already. So consider the following as a longish confession that I'm just late to the party. I will make my thesis more precise in a bit. Slide change. My remarks will be divided into 5 parts: introduction and a bit more, physicalism, tolerance, what isn't there, and summary. Change slide. What follows is at best a work in progress. And I fear that I may be using the word progress too loosely. In any case, I am sure that some of it, perhaps a lot, will have to be revised. I will speak in this paper chiefly about the project of the Aufbau, rather than only the parts of the project that Carnap actually carried out in that book. The project is vast, nothing less than the logical construction on a slender basis of all human knowledge, indeed of all that is humanly knowable. This is a project that will take many lifetimes and require massive advances in sciences as well. The most that one could hope for in a single volume is an outline of the project and a demonstration by example that important progress could be made if only we have the courage to take the project up. The model for Carnap's project is undoubtedly Whitehead and Russell's Principia Mathematica. The project of the logical construction of mathematics had been going on for 50 years and arguably much, much longer. Carnap's project is even more ambitious, so it is no wonder that his completed constructions are meager in comparison. There is good reason to concentrate on the project, though unfinished. In undertaking the Aufbau, Carnap committed himself to its completability, and so the project is the better indicator of his commitments, of what he believed at the time of the Aufbau was published, than are the comparatively small parts of the project that are completed. With the idea of the project fully in mind, my thesis is that the project, together with Carnap's prior commitments, implies or includes, albeit in sometimes embryonic form, almost all of the important parts of the theses that Carnap developed more explicitly in the Vienna Circle years. I put the word theses in shutter quotes because the principle of tolerance is not so much a thesis as it is, well, a principle, or a stance, or possibly even an invitation. And I say the Vienna Circle years because Carnap continued to attend Vienna Circle meetings even after he moved to Prague. The theses I have in mind are verificationism of some sort, the unity of science, the rejection of metaphysics, physicalism, and tolerance. I won't be able to talk about all 5 here, so I will make only a few remarks about the first 3 before moving on to say something in more detail about 4 and 5. Regarding verificationism, there is no doubt that the Aufbau, finished or not, meets a very high standard of verificationist demands. Carnap himself, in his intellectual autobiography, claimed that in the Aufbau he had accepted what came to be called complete verificationism. And something seems to be happening with the slides, but okay, good, we're back. I.e. the sort of view that forced Schlick to say that so-called laws of nature are not empirically meaningful statements that are either true or false. And there are statements toward the end of Carnap's book that admit of that interpretation. Roughly 1,000 years ago, I argued, was that by my grandfather, great-grandfather? I don't know. That the preponderance of evidence of the book suggests that Carnap's view in the Aufbau is better described as confirmationism, the weaker and more plausible version of verificationism. More recently, Thomas Ebel has argued convincingly that Carnap did accept the stronger version, but only for about a year, and even that was several years after the Aufbau was published. I need only add that 2 years before the Aufbau, Carnap had said in Physical Concept Formation, 1926, at least for quantitative concepts, that without a method of measurement that assigns particular numbers to particular physical objects, the magnitude itself is not determined and statements concerning it are meaningless. This is confined to quantitative concepts, but it is, at least in embryonic form, the same idea that Carnap gives more explicitly in Pseudo-Problems in Philosophy, written at the same time as the Aufbau and published in the same year. I might not need to explain the unity, I need not mention the unity of science or rejection of metaphysics, because Carnap so obviously embraces both in the Aufbau. But I will say on the topic of unity, only that there is only one form of disunity that Carnap is fighting. At the time that Carnap was writing the Aufbau, there were those who said that the Geisteswissenschaften were fundamentally different from the Naturwissenschaften in that the former required as basic evidence such things as empathy, metaphysical insight, or intuition. These are methods that are not allowed as evidence in the Naturwissenschaften. I think that the fight for unity in this precise sense is central to the Aufbau, and that in giving what he sometimes calls epistemic analyses, and what I call logical constructions, he has given just the right sort of argument to establish the unity he wanted. If you want me to elaborate, we can discuss it in the Q&A. Regarding metaphysics, I will say that Carnap is targeting here a specific view as well, one that prominent metaphysicians of the time period in Europe chose for themselves. This is the view that philosophers by a priori means can go behind, beyond, or deeper than the claims that ordinary science can reach, and even reach knowledge that can correct the findings of that ordinary science. I will leave it to your own determination whether those on the present scene who call themselves metaphysicians fit the definition that Carnap's contemporary metaphysicians chose for themselves. In any case, it seems clear that if the Aufbau project succeeds, there would be no room for metaphysics in that sense, or for suprascientific claims of any sort. Change the slide, please. Carnap's physicalism of 1932 consisted of two claims. First, all of the cognitively meaningful claims of science can be translated into the physical language. And second, the physical language is the only language for which this is the case. Here I will claim only that the Aufbau project implies the first. In order to make that claim, I will try to establish what I have called a reciprocal containment thesis. Whether the second claim of physicalism is true is a matter that awaits discussion. It depends on what conditions are placed on the claims of science. While I do not reach a firm conclusion, my discussion of physicalism's second half will focus on the issue of intersubjectivity. Even for this second thesis, our discussion of the Aufbau helps to clarify the issue. Change slides, please. As you may recall, toward the end of his career, Quine advanced what he called a reciprocal containment thesis. That is, epistemology contains ontology, natural science, and that ontology contains epistemology. I think that Carnap too had a reciprocal containment thesis in the Aufbau, but a different one. You won't find it in the completed constructions or in any explicit statement of it anywhere. But the project that the Aufbau sets out commits Carnap to the reciprocal containment of physics and psychology. I don't know of any discussions of this in the literature, but I might have missed them. And I do know of some really good scholars who would not only deny that such a reciprocal containment thesis is implied by the Aufbau project, they have denied that it is even consistent with that project. Carnap's commitment to such a thesis implies the first major claim of physicalism and thus considerably narrows the gap, if any, from the Aufbau to Carnap's physicalism of the early 30s. The first question to be addressed is, what in this context is the reciprocal containment thesis? It has two parts. A, that all physical truths can be translated into psychological ones, and B, that all psychological truths can be translated into physical ones. And for both parts, the standards of translation are the ones that Carnap uses, but does not explicitly state in the Aufbau: non-accidental coextensiveness. That is, coextensiveness on the basis of logical laws and laws of nature. My claim is not about the construction that Carnap actually completes in the Aufbau, nor is my claim about the alternative construction that Carnap mentions in that book but does not begin, a construction whose base level is the physical level. Instead, my claim is about the construction that Carnap does begin in the Aufbau. As you recall, the Aufbau has 4 levels, the most basic of which is the autopsychological level, roughly claims about my own mind. Actually, the basis of the whole edifice is far narrower, namely claims involving a single predicate. This is used to construct quality classes. Carnap's aim at this level is to construct concepts that are intersubjective, despite the fact that only I have my experiences. Roughly, the strategy is to build a logical structure on my experiences, and then identify the concepts with this logical structure. Since you could build the same structure on your experiences, we could share the concepts thus defined. The concepts at this first autopsychological level are to be used to construct the second level of physical concepts. Carnap doesn't give any actual definitions, but lays out roughly how the construction might go. The physical concepts of this second level are then used to construct those of the third level, the heteropsychological level, and those, together with the physical concepts, are to be used to construct the fourth level, i.e. the cultural level. By the way, there is an issue here as to whether only level 2 claims are needed to construct those of 3, or whether claims and concepts of both levels 1 and 2 are needed for the task. Frankly, I don't think that Carnap's Geisteswissenschaftler interlocutors, if any, would have cared, but it does matter. The issue is very complicated and best left for a time when we have a few years for the discussion. In any case, the completed construction would unify all of the sciences on a common evidence base. While the accomplishments of the Aufbau were considerable, the upper stages of the construction were part of the project, but not yet accomplished fact. It is important to note that there is no claim in the Aufbau that the base level objects are real, that only the base level objects are real, or that conversely, the constructed objects are unreal. Carnap was not only uninterested in such ontological questions, he thought that they amounted to a dangerous metaphysics. Next slide. Okay. Good. Carnap phrased the intended structure by saying that level 4 was to be reduced to level 3 to 2, and level 2 to level 1. Reduced is indeed Carnap's word, but it no longer conveys to most people what he had in mind. Nowadays, to say that something is being reduced is to suggest that something's being left out. And that's not quite right for the Aufbau or afterward. For various reasons, I will say instead that level 4 claims can be translated into or constructed out of those of level 3, and so on, or to say that concepts and claims of level 2 can be logically constructed out of those of level 1, and in general that the higher levels can be constructed out of the lower levels. I think this leaves Carnap's intentions intact. Next slide. My starting point is that Carnap is committed to whatever is required to make his project in the Aufbau successful. That is, in unifying the sciences against the particular disunities alleged by the Geisteswissenschaftler that their sciences require something more than ordinary observation as a basis, namely empathy, insight, intuition, projection of oneself into the mind of another, and so on. Thus, Carnap would be committed to a great many things that he does not say, and to the possibility of a great many constructions that he does not undertake in the Aufbau. Mine is essentially a logical argument about what is required to get where he wants to go and do so along the lines he proposes. Nowhere in the Aufbau does Carnap attempt to reduce the autopsychological to physics, or to say that the autopsychological can be translated into the language of physics. This is generally thought to be a later development. As I said, I shy away from the word reduction, though it is Carnap's word, and try to make my claims about translation or construction instead. In any case, Carnap can be committed to something whether he says so or not, and sometimes he might be committed to something at variance with what he says. Next slide. I don't think that Carnap gives or intends to give really explicit definitions of anything above the autopsychological level. Quine says that Carnap tried and failed to give such definitions for the physical level. I say that he didn't try, but gave only adequacy conditions. Quine, of course, goes further than this premise and infers from it that no such definitions of central physical terms are possible from Carnap's starting point. Presumably, Quine's reasoning was that if Carnap tried and failed, then there is no hope for the rest of us. Nonetheless, Quine's conclusion is a modal one, and it does not follow from his premise, even if that premise were true. As a sidelight, I don't think that Carnap's intended audience, whether Naturwissenschaftler or Geisteswissenschaftler, would have balked at his claim that physics and the natural sciences generally are constructible on the basis of truths at the autopsychological level. Exceptions might be Driesch for the case of biology or Bergson even for physics. Others would balk only at the heteropsychological or cultural level. And Carnap certainly does not give in the Aufbau any explicit definitions there. He sketches a few in psychology and the physical language. Next slide. For Carnap's project to succeed, the construction must capture, that is, render as true, not just some of what we think we know in physics, but all or virtually all. Without that, those who might wish to reject empiricism in physics would simply shrug and say, so much the worse for your methods. See, they said, we have to use insight, empathy, or revelation, all the things that metaphysicians use and that Carnap lists and condemns at the end of physical language. Mutatis mutandis for the heteropsychological level. If you can't get a fairly detailed, albeit structural, knowledge of the contents of other minds by Aufbau methods, then so much the worse for those methods. The same goes for the cultural level. Unless, at least in principle, most of the details of history, including the arts, philology, and the rest of the Geisteswissenschaften, can be captured, his argument for the unity of science and against empathy as methods looks pretty weak. Next slide. Now, I don't think that Carnap has to finish the project and provide all definitions in a single book. Such a demand would be unreasonable. The construction of mathematics from logic, or for Quineans from logic and set theory, was a century-long project. But I think that Carnap must and does commit himself to the completability of his autopsychologically based Aufbau project. He also needs to provide rigorous definitions for part of the project as a demonstration of principle, and to do this further than anyone would have thought possible. And this he does in the definitions of quality classes in level 1. Whether those definitions succeed is a different matter and is still controversial. I think he does succeed well enough. It is in this sense that Carnap commits himself to the completability of the Aufbau project, not by its supplementation with a different construction, but by the autopsychologically based construction that he starts in the Aufbau. What would such a completed project look like? To begin with, there would be a great many truths, accepted sentences, that Carnap doesn't talk about very much. These must include truths about very particular events and even general law-like claims at level 1. An example of the former might be, I am now having a yellow patch in the middle of my visual field. The concepts of yellow and visual field, etc., would of course be fully structured. But there would be no subject, no I. So the more perspicuous statement of this would be yellow here now. And there could be general claims such as jagged flashes are generally followed by loud crashes. The logical mathematical vocabulary seems to be included in level 1, just as it is in the mathematically extended observational vocabulary in his later work in philosophy of science. These are the claims that either will or will not be translated if I'm to make good on my argument. As long as we stay at level 1, there is not only no subject that has the experience, there is no reason to call the events involved psychological. At level 1, there is simply no such contrast between psychological and non-psychological, between mental and physical, to be drawn. I am not denying that the goings-on are psychological. I'm saying that calling them so, or showing that they are psychological, will have to wait till later in the constructions. when the appropriate contrasts are at hand. The same can be said about subjectivity. I don't deny that the goings-on at level 1 are subjective, but we have no basis for saying that until later in the construction. Similarly, there is no point at level 1 to calling the events there described mine. Mine as opposed to what? Carnap frequently calls these events auto-psychological, but this is clearly by way of anticipation of later stages in the construction. He already knows what they're going to turn out to be. Next slide. Also among the inner episodes at the auto-psychological level are cognitive ones, the current conceptual thinking, that is, judgments rather than sensations. The internal logic of these cognitive episodes is rather different from the sensory ones. Carnap has the unnamed subject making lots of judgments, but I am unaware of any explicit discussions of judgments at level 1 or elsewhere. I could be wrong about that, so please point me to the passages if I am. For example, I may be thinking right now that the square root of 2 is irrational, and that seems not to involve any sensations of the number 2. But on our ordinary understanding of first-person knowledge, we can know what we are cognitively thinking fairly directly and reliably. I don't think I'm contradicting Carnap here. He later phrases this as saying that the causal pathways between the events known and the judgments about them in first-person knowledge simply do not go outside the body. So I would guess that there must be something that thinking that the square root of 2 is irrational feels like. The British empiricists avoided this issue by slopping both cognitive and sensory under the heading of ideas, which they then proceeded to treat as sensory. Hence, there could be no abstract ideas. This is not a mistake that Kant made, or Descartes either. Carnap treats all of the evidence for all scientific theories as statements or sentences, and hence as cognitive. If it turns out that he did not treat cognitive events at level 1, then we may never know how he did so, how he would have. I do not argue that at level 2, Carnap does or should translate the auto-psychological truths directly into physical truths. But I stop short of saying that he can't do so. I suspect that as a logical matter, he is committed to the possibility of doing so, but I think there is a much more natural route to my conclusion. In any case, there is one object at level 2 that has a striking correlation with the doings and claims at level 1. That is my body. At least by this point, there are other bodies, and we can pick out one of them and designate it any way we want. Next slide. That brings us to level 3. Here, I think that Carnap is committed to constructing not merely some general claims about other minds, but fairly detailed claims about the contents of other minds, one corresponding to each human body constructed at level 2. And not just their thoughts about the natural world, but also their beliefs about other minds. This would all be structural in the same sense that quality classes are, but it must be doable in principle. If it can't be done, there's no hope for Carnap's construction of level 4. Yes, all of this must be translatable, reducible into level 2 and thereby into level 1. But that does not get Carnap off the hook of the in-principle constructability of all these details at level 3. The whole project depends on it. There are, in both the Aufbau and in psychology and the physical language, 2 general strategies for carrying out the construction. One is via neurophysics. At the project stage. Carnap, I think, believes that there is to be found natural law that expresses this parallelism. But he recognizes that at this stage of knowledge, we are not in a position to let the details of the parallelism guide the details of the construction. The second strategy is via behavioral criterion. He sketches this in the Aufbau and provides more detail, though it is still a sketch, in a later paper. I'm not entirely happy with everything that Carnap says here, but I don't have to be. Next slide. Whatever the general principles for constructing minds, among the minds so constructed will be one connected to the body identified as mine at level 2. And the claims about the contents of that level 3 mind, had better closely parallel the claims in level 1. Otherwise, there is simply no point or content to the idea that the claims of level 1 are psychological or mine. If yellow here now is true at level 1, then there really needs to be a truth at level 3 that that mind now has a yellow patch in its visual field. Given this close parallel, it seems that there is a non-accidental correlation between the claims of level 1 and those about this mind at level 3. And without that correlation, there is simply no reason to call the claims at level 1 psychological or about me. This correlation allows a translation, I didn't say reduction, of level 1 claims to level 3 claims. And hence a translation via the construction of level 3 from level 2 to level 1 claims into those of level 2. So on this reading of the Aufbau, everything can be translated into the, or at least a, physical language, which is the main claim of the physical language as universal language of science. Next slide. Thus, on the assumption that Carnap is committed to what it would take for the Aufbau project to succeed, Carnap is committed to the translatability of both the autopsychological and the heteropsychological claims into the physical ones of level 2. This is the B half of the reciprocal containment thesis and what I set out to show. Since Carnap already explicitly states that level 2 claims, physical ones, are reducible, translatable into those of level 1, autopsychological ones, and this is the A half of the reciprocal containment thesis, Carnap seems to be committed in the Aufbau to the full reciprocal containment thesis and thus to the first major claim of physicalism. Next slide. But what about the second major claim of physicalism? i.e., that the physical language is the only language into which all of science can be translated. It would be much easier to see what this means if Carnap had given an argument for it, but as far as I can see, he didn't. So I won't try to argue that the Aufbau or the Aufbau project implies this second claim of physicalism. Any such claim will depend on whether there are additional conditions on translatability or on science, and such claims are likely to involve questions of intersubjectivity as well. But I do think that a study of the Aufbau and even some of the considerations that we have raised so far can help to clarify some of the issues of this second claim of physicalism. On the face of it, this second claim, that there is only one language into which all of science can be translated, has problems. For one thing, the phrase "the physical language" suggests that Carnap thinks that there is only one physical language, but surely there are many. Perhaps this worry can be set aside by treating the phrase that looks like a definite description as a distributive singular term instead. As a distributive singular term, it is really for referring to all physical languages, just as the llama is a hairy goat refers to all llamas. Even ignoring the possible uniqueness claim of the second part of physicalism, it looks just false. The Aufbau, after all, says that all levels can be translated into the autopsychological level. I don't see that Carnap ever withdrew that claim thereafter. So perhaps there are some additional but unstated conditions that are involved. I wouldn't try to deny the second claim until I see those conditions formulated. The additional conditions probably concern intersubjectivity or the directness of confirmation. The formulations that I can think of are in considerable danger of being either trivially true or importantly false, but I am in no position to say for sure. One possibility is that the needed additional conditions concern intersubjectivity. Heinrich Neider, a graduate student at the time of the Vienna Circle, claimed 40 years after the fact to have convinced Carnap to, quote, drop the autopsychological, close quote, level and thereby become a physicalist because the claims at level 1 are not intersubjectively verifiable as scientific claims need to be. Neither, of course, neither also claim to have invented physicalism. In any case, the reciprocal containment thesis that even in the project of the autopsychologically based construction, all claims of all levels can be translated into both the physical level taken by itself and also into the autopsychological level taken by itself. It also implies that all of the claims of all of the levels are intersubjectively confirmable, if any level is, though not directly so. If the issue is intersubjectivity, then Carnap has already discussed it at some length in the Aufbau. Quasi-analysis is to yield structural descriptions that allow the level 1 concepts to be intersubjective, and thus also all concepts constructed from them. And Carnap discusses intersubjectivity and the need for that in science in sections 148 and 149 and following. I admit that some of what Carnap says is confusing, at least to me. So it seems to me just too unclear to say how much distance there is, if any, between the Aufbau and the second major claim of physicalism. Change slides. My thesis that many of Carnap's commitments are there by the date of the Aufbau is both less clear and more important when we come to tolerance, which is in some ways the linchpin of his mature philosophy. This is because, in part, tolerance is itself not a thesis, but a principle or a stance or an attitude, or perhaps possibly even an invitation to interpret some views that apparently contradict one another in a way that avoids, quote, wearisome controversies, close quote. Finding the elements of an attitude is hard, nor do I think that the principle had crystallized by the time of the Aufbau. To find elements of tolerance, we first have to know what we are looking for. That is, to have some idea of what tolerance is. This is less obvious than one might suppose. It is certainly not indifference or an unwillingness to choose sides or to defend one's choices. Perhaps the following 3 ideas can be thought to constitute tolerance on a given issue. Recognition that on that issue there are alternatives that apparently conflict. Recognition that one lacks, perhaps permanently, epistemic reasons for choosing among them in a non-question begging, non-epistemically arbitrary way. And 3, a commitment to the idea that there is no fact of the matter about which is to be correct or incorrect. There is no fact of the matter about which to be correct or incorrect. This is the part that Carnap does not yet in 1928 have, or only sort of has. For the issue where Carnap wants to invoke tolerance most, Wittgenstein, at least in the Tractatus, rejects 1, and Quine and Russell reject 3. 1 and 2 can lead to paralyzing skepticism or to a 17th century version of skepticism, namely that the idea that though we are never justified, we can both believe and act. To find elements of tolerance in 1928 or before, we can begin with Carnap's autobiographical report on his first interactions with physicists and philosophers. The report is admittedly 35 years after the fact, but I see no reason to doubt him. In that report, Carnap says that he fell naturally into speaking the thing language with physicists and into some sort of phenomenal language with philosophers. He was surprised when some found this inconsistent. A second anticipation of tolerance is to be found in the notion of logical construction itself. Such construction is central to the Aufbau because its main model is Principia Mathematica construction of mathematics on the basis of first and second order logic, or logic plus set theory if you're Quine. Carnap often speaks of epistemic analysis, but what he is doing more nearly logical construction. As I'm using the word construction, it differs from analysis in more than just the direction of the effort. An analysis is a separation into component or constituent parts, all of which were there before we started. If you don't get the parts right, your analysis is just incorrect. In a logical construction, things are quite different. It doesn't make any difference what elements one begins with, so long as the result of the construction behaves properly. You can get the target wrong, but you can't get the elements wrong. Frege and Russell each constructed the number 2 as the set of all pairs. But 2 could have been constructed as the unit set of its predecessor, or as the set of all its predecessors. Neither would be incorrect. Now, you might prefer one or another for whatever reason, but none of them is wrong. Carnap does say that he presents the auto-psychologically based constructions in the Aufbau because of considerations of epistemic correctness. I think he means something quite different from what we've just been talking about. And he never calls the physically based construction that he says is possible wrong. But in sorting that out, while important, that would take us very far afield indeed. The bottom line is that logical construction allows one to construct the very same concept on different bases. I don't say that this is full-blown tolerance, much less that it applied in all the ways that Carnap will come to apply it. But it is at least a cousin of tolerance and shows a bit of family resemblance. A third anticipation of tolerance is to be found in the widespread discussion throughout the first 3 decades of the 20th century of convention. There is not just one notion at play here. I cannot possibly try to review them all. Moreover, it is not at all surprising that in the light of development of relativity, that many philosophers and mathematicians would be asking how much freedom we have in revising traditional notions such as length, simultaneity, and straight line. The notion of convention that I have in mind is roughly this: the recognition that there are choices of concepts to be made, and also that there is often no non-arbitrary epistemic grounds for choosing among them. Sounds familiar? The important consequence of this sort of conventionalism is that scientists are free to choose concepts or construct new ones if that is scientifically useful. Of course, some conventionalists thought that the freedom to choose was much wider than the choice of concepts. But concepts are enough for now. Often, however, there is an important restriction. We are told to hold logic and the totality of empirical facts fixed, so that we are allowed choice only in the space that logic and these facts leaves open. The result is something like Quinean underdetermination. I will have to say more about Quine in a moment, but late in his life, Quine himself recognized in an unpublished paper that his underdetermination was much like what Carnap meant by convention. That fact that many writers took us to have a great deal of freedom in choosing our methods of measurement, that is, in constructing our concepts, amount to full-blown tolerance? No. This is because many of the examples used, perhaps all of them, resulted in theories that could be intertranslated in a truth-preserving way. And the logical and even seemingly metaphysical cases where Carnap wants to use tolerance, such intertranslatability is not always available to reassure us. Language 2 in the logical syntax of language is not translatable into language 1. And Platonist mathematics is not translatable into more abstemious alternatives. So it is probably fruitless to ask how Carnap would have addressed a failure of translatability, since I am unaware that he addressed it before the 30s. As a consequence, I don't quite want to say that Carnap is committed to tolerance by 1928. Even so, conventionalism, especially if it spreads to logic, is not very far from tolerance. It may seem that Quine's Truth by Convention, 36, and Carnap and Logical Truth of 1963, but it was written in 54, would be relevant here. Both papers talk about Carnap and something that Quine calls conventional truth. In each case, what Quine means is so vastly different from what Carnap means that it is hard to see that any issue is joined. Again, I can say more about this in the Q&A if you like. There is one final anticipation of tolerance that is very, very close. That's to be found in Hilbert's treatment of pure geometry, a treatment that Carnap largely adopts. Even from his dissertation, Carnap seems to have accepted a certain narrative about developments in geometry from Kant to Einstein. The story is repeated in Carnap's late Philosophy of Science textbook. In any case, the narrative amounts to a serious argument. One of the great mathematicians of the age, Hilbert was faced with a multiplicity of geometries, just as Carnap was to be faced with a multiplicity of logics in the 30s. On Hilbert's account, we must first distinguish pure from physical geometry. This is the model for Carnap's later distinction between pure and descriptive syntax, pure and descriptive semantics, and pure and descriptive pragmatics. Quine rejected Hilbert's distinction. For pure mathematical geometry, there are, besides the traditional Euclidean geometry, many genuine alternatives that are all on a par mathematically. Each can be treated axiomatically. The axioms of each system are, in effect, implicit definitions of the geometrical terms used, though Hilbert seems not to have liked that phrase. Thus, there is not real conflict among these systems. They are talking about different things. Physical geometry is an empirical geometry. But even so, Poincaré claims that we can decide to preserve Euclidean geometry because it is simpler. Einstein thought otherwise. It's a complicated story that would carry us far beyond this paper. The point is that Hilbert's account of pure geometry, which Carnap adopted well before the Aufbau, is a close model, a very close model for Carnap's later logical pluralism, that is, for the principle of tolerance. The difference is that Carnap generalizes it to logic and from there to all of what is traditionally called the a priori. Of course, there are many further details, both about Hilbert's model and about Carnap's use of it. The Aufbau is not primarily about geometry, pure or otherwise, and there is no extended discussion of geometry. But Carnap does explicitly embrace the distinction between pure and physical geometry, and I see no reason to think that Hilbert's treatment of pure geometry has been discarded. So we have seen that tolerance has a number of antecedents in 1928 or before, in his early interactions with physicists and philosophers, in the very idea of logical construction, in his conventionalism, and most closely of all in Carnap's embrace of Hilbert's treatment of pure geometry. Does it all add up to tolerance in the full sense? No, not quite. But even in 1928, Carnap was very close to what appeared unnamed in 1932 in on protocol sentences, and explicitly in 1934 as the principle of tolerance. Next slide. Close Carnap may be, but there are two important features of his mature philosophy that are not really there in 1928. These aren't the only absent features, but they are sufficient for my purposes. The first of these, perhaps, is empiricism. Carnap thought that traditional empiricism was incapable of dealing with mathematics and logic, a view he shared with his teacher, Frege. And traditional empiricism couldn't really deal with physics either, because there were too many methodological principles involved for which it had no satisfactory account. Carnap also thought that traditional rationalism was incapable of dealing with physics. And if Kantianism in its original form was thought to be a synthesis of empiricism and rationalism, it didn't quite work either. Certainly the point of Frege's work was to replace Kant's account of mathematics. The idea that Carnap was not an empiricist in the Aufbau came as news to Quine, who seemed to treat Carnap as the last and greatest of the British empiricists. It is Michael Friedman and Alan Richardson who roused us all from such dogmatic slumbers. Carnap is a neo-Kantian in the Aufbau in both his questions and his answers. But Carnap did become an empiricist, though not a British one, in some full sense of that term. What happened? Wittgenstein, in one of his more benign influences on the Vienna Circle, had put forward in the Tractatus what can be called a no-content theory of logic. I won't try to be too precise about what Wittgenstein was showing but not saying in that book. To put it in somewhat foreign vocabulary, what Carnap grasped from the Tractatus was that logic does not distinguish this world from any other possible way that things might have been, and so does not really describe it all. Logic has no content and so does not need any justification, empirical or otherwise. This leaves the door open for a robust empiricism for everything that does have content, and so it leaves the way open for a comprehensive account of both physics, empirical science, on one hand, and mathematics and logic on the other. The other feature absent from the Aufbau, to which I want to call attention, is the meta-mathematical point of view. If I had to pick out a time when Carnap assumed this point of view, I would say sometime in the couple of months between Carnap's first hearing of Gödel's brilliant use of meta-mathematical techniques in deriving his incompleteness theorems, and Carnap's sleepless night in January of 1931, the product of which was 44 pages of shorthand notes on metalogic. I am not intending these remarks as history of logic, but I would classify Hilbert, Gödel, and Tarski as all taking a meta-mathematical perspective, and Frege, Russell, and Wittgenstein as not doing so. Quine is a bit more complicated, but on the whole, I would say that he did not either. For an interesting comparison, see papers by Van Heernoort and Hindemith. This meta-mathematical point of view allows Carnap more readily to generalize Hilbert's account of pure geometry into an account of pure logic, and to see in Poincaré's discussion the freedom we have in giving a physical geometry, an account of the methodological principles that had resisted traditional empiricism. The change in point of view also helps to shift the focus from the correctness of a given logic to such other considerations as convenience and fruitfulness that do not admit of yes and no answers. Even if it is a comparatively short distance from the Aufbau to tolerance and the other theses of the Vienna Circle years, we need some sort of account of what moved Carnap from one position to the other. Here's my hypothesis. It was the Vienna Circle itself. The intense discussions from multiple points of view and the palpable sense of community and joint purpose deserve to be characters in their own right in this story. It is difficult to articulate, but the circle had an impact on Carnap that he never forgot. To the end of his life, he continually referred to my friends and I, and as thinking this or that. It was his paradigm of a truly scientific, philosophical community. It was a community that did not stop at the boundaries of Vienna, but included groups in Berlin and elsewhere. And for that matter, it included allied artistic, cultural, and political developments both then and thereafter. In all, the community, in Vienna especially, played a role in Carnap's development that those of us who focus on the content of Carnap's ideas are apt to overlook. I add, however, that one writer who has not overlooked the role of the community is Thomas Ebel. Perhaps it will also take a community to understand Carnap. Slide. In these remarks, I've tried to assess whether some or all of the theses of Carnap's Vienna Circle years were present in some form and to some degree in his commitments in the Aufbau or earlier. Of those theses, verificationism, the unity of science, the rejection of metaphysics, physicalism, and tolerance, I treated the first three only briefly, and the last two, physicalism and tolerance, at much greater length. The first major part of physicalism seems to be directly implied by commitments involved in the project of the Aufbau. The second major part of physicalism, that the physical language is the only language into which the whole of science can be translated, was less clear, if only because it was unclear what led Carnap to embrace this view. To the extent that this involved intersubjectivity, that theme too was very much present in the Aufbau. On the matter of tolerance, it is almost surely not completely there at the time of the Aufbau. But the sheer number of antecedents and the closeness of the Hilbert model of pure geometry suggests that tolerance is not far off. But not everything is there in the Aufbau. Carnap is not an empiricist there, certainly not to the extent that Quine supposed. In this connection, I noted the role of Wittgenstein's no-content theory of logic in moving Carnap toward a robust empiricism. Carnap's later meta-mathematical point of view is not there in the Aufbau either, and it is important. Finally, we considered what could have moved Carnap to the fully developed theses of the Vienna years and to the empiricism and metamathematical stance he arrived at. My hypothesis was that the motive force was the too much neglected character in the story, namely the Vienna Circle and larger community around Carnap. I am fully aware that everything I have said needs fuller and more detailed discussion, but even my sketch suggests that Carnap really did inherit more from his grandfather than might have been supposed. So have we all. Thank you. Slide. Another slide. And thanks to Michael, Alan, and Thomas, and so many others who've taught me so much. Thanks to colleagues Jane Mindshine and Michael White for their help, and to the organizers and to all of you for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you for this interesting talk. There is someone that raised his hand, but now we have 10 minutes break, and we will meet again for Q&A at so in 10 minutes, because we have different hours. So in 10 minutes, we come back. Thank you again.
Thanks, Katerina, for handling the slides.
So here we are. We can start in a few minutes. So Katerina, are you able to turn on your mic? Yes, it works. Good. It is? It works? That's, yeah. So we can start in 1 minute, just waiting for Luca. Is coming back. Yes, so you can start raising your hand and we'll follow the cue.
I have a question.
Yeah, but just 1 minute. You're waiting for Oliva is back, and Jerry, you are in the queue. You are the third. Okay.
Thank you.
Maybe Luca is a little late. Jerry, please can you turn your mic? Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, so maybe Luca is a little bit in late, but we can start. The first in line is Frederick Stadler. So please, Frederick, go ahead with your question.
I hope you can see me and hear me.
Yeah, we can
Okay.
see and hear you.
Okay. So, greetings from Vienna. Thanks, Rick, for this pleasing lecture. I enjoyed very much. I have only two remarks and one question. The first remark is that the discussion on physicalism around 1930 was raised by, of course, you mentioned Heinrich Neider, who wrote a dissertation on the notion of understanding with Schlick, and who, together with Neurath, tried to convince Carnap, obviously, to turn from a phenomenalistic to a physicalist language, which did occur afterwards. You mentioned it. So it was in the air that because of the aim of intersubjectivity, there should be a strong move to a physicalist language. And you did not mention the phenomenalist version in the Aufbau. Was it by accident or was it consciously? The second and a similar point is regarding a principle of tolerance, which was claimed at the same time by Karl Menger, by young Karl Menger, as an antecedent of, or as an inventor of this principle, at least in mathematics and logic. And my last question would be that why Carnap, who wrote in his autobiography that the project of the Aufbau is principally viable, in retrospect, going back to Marx Elements, etc., and etc., why he did not finish this project.
Okay. Am I? No, I'm not muted. The first was a comment that I didn't mention Carnap's phenomenalist position. I did talk almost exclusively about his autopsychologically based construction, which is taken by many to be a phenomenalist construction, although Carnap does not say that only the objects and events, concepts, and so on of level one are real, and that the others are not real. So he resisted that sort of thing. But I think I was talking almost exclusively about his so-called phenomenalist position.
So I'm satisfied.
And then you note that Menger claims, and I think quite rightly, that he was with tolerance before Carnap was, in the confines at least of set theory. And set theory is, like logic, not on the empirical side of things, and Menger deserves the credit for that. But I'm pointing out that even within Carnap's own world, I mean his own mind, the things that he talked about and so on, there were lots and lots of antecedents. And he talked a lot about conventionalism. I mean, he talked about all the things that I mentioned, that he was comfortable moving back and forth between the languages of the physicists and the philosophers. And he specifically embraced the Hilbert version of pure geometry, which I think is very, very close. It's just astoundingly close. And yeah, he has some differences with Hilbert, and Frege has huge differences with Hilbert. Yeah, Carnap was a student of Frege, but when it came right down to the debate that the Frege and Hilbert were having, he was really on Hilbert's side for the most part, or so I would say.
That's correct.
Why not finish the project? Because it's too huge for anybody to finish. And what he wanted to do in that book was to show, look, we can get started. He was always disappointed thereafter that no one took him up to join this throng that was to do the constructions, as there had been a throng to construct mathematics. Before Whitehead and Russell got there, or Frege got there for that matter, Kronecker can say that God made the natural numbers and man made all the rest. I'm not trying to enlist Kronecker into this enterprise, but in a sense, the construction from numbers there on up had already been worked on by a community of people. And Carnap was hoping that a community of people, and I think he didn't care as much that it should be phenomenally based as that they should be doing logical construction. So why didn't he carry it further? Well, he was hoping that he would enlist other people to do it. And it's not a job for a lifetime. It's a job for many lifetimes.
Okay, I agree.
And he was very pleased when Nelson Goodman has a different construction, but he was the only one until Hannes who undertook the enterprise of this kind of construction.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, we can go ahead. So the second in line is Michael Stolzner. Please, Michael.
Hi. I mean, one of the questions about tolerance is always to make this principle precise, right? Whether it's a tolerance of different points of view, as in the Aufbau, whether behaviorist, a sort of neutral monist view, or whether we are really after 35, or that we have some sense of meta logic, etc. But when you say Hilbert and Vienna, I find this pretty interesting because in Vienna, of course, he runs into people who knew Hilbert's geometry very well. Unfortunately, we have little records what he talked about with Hahn. But of course, Hahn answered to Hilbert's program, and Tom Übel has written something on that. And for me, it's always interesting his fight with what the Hilbertians really do about geometry. Because the question is, where does pure geometry as a mathematical object end? And where is that where the physics wants to connect to? And a lot of people were doing this restructuring of the axiomatics of the foundations of geometry. And those are the people that Carnap talks with, Balders, and then he has 36s with Bergman, and then he tries his rather naive idea of the Gabelbarkeitssatz, etc., etc. And I think in the 20s, he's aware of that. In a comment on the 29 meeting, he says, well, you know, there's what the mathematicians somehow expand ontology, and of course the logicians control it. And then he thinks, well, the physicist, somehow the model of applying to that. So I think he's aware of that this is kind of very tricky. We don't know much what he was talking with Hahn, but Hahn was 2 semesters in Göttingen and very much involved in Hilbert's mathematic project, and certainly one of the best mathematicians of his generation. So I was just wondering, to have a question at the end, how your idea of the history of tolerance and Hilbert fits into these debates about the general axiomatics that a couple of people, Georg Schiemer included, have conducted over the last years.
Well, I'm not going to try and wade into a technical debate here, but I think what most concerns Carnap is the ability of tolerance to sidestep certain kinds of debates that seemed important to philosophers, as to, for example, which one of the to mathematicians, which one of the geometries was correct. Hilbert's answer is they all are. They're just in different vocabularies. That's essentially the same argument that Carnap employs the principle of tolerance in logical syntax for. And I think the foreword or introduction, I can't remember which title it has, that talks about this. He says, look, we have the language of Principia, and that's become classical, but there are others, and the search for which one is the correct one is a fruitless one. And the main point of the book is to say, look, we don't have to search for which one is the correct one. And that's, I think, the philosophic payoff for him for tolerance. And it can be framed in a number of different ways. And it's obviously not a view that everybody in the neighborhood accepted. He's urging us to work on problems where we can make headway and choose the alternatives perhaps on the basis of convenience, fruitfulness, but above all, philosophers don't get to choose. As far as the terms of physics are concerned, Bergson does not get to tell Einstein what notion of simultaneity to use.
Yeah, that I think that for sure. But if you look what the people in the Hilbert tradition did, so you can rebuild the geometry in a way, and you're absolutely right in this sense. Well, here's the geometry, and then there is no absolute answer, but I can still say, well, how do I want my system of pure geometry to build in such a way as that I can test physical hypothesis or possible physical hypothesis, because they're also playing, obviously, after 26 with more. Can I rework the 1900 model in such a way that the Archimedean axiom comes sort of last, that I would allow non-Archimedean geometries? So I can play more with the mathematics and still have this general idea. Yeah, it's a pure geometry, but maybe one geometry sort of fits better to the physical. And it is then this geometry which I would love to be complete in that sense, as Carnap played with in the 1929, 1930. That I really get the separation going.
Well, it's interesting to compare what Quine says about pure geometry in, say, the 36 paper, The Truth by Convention. For him, pure geometry is science fiction. It's, we conventionally imagine that the geometry is true by non-convention. So there is no distinction between pure and applied geometry. It's just whether we're playing with the abstract subject and not worrying at the moment about the evidence that geometry is geometry. There's no point in drawing the distinction. Carnap, on the other hand, is perfectly happy to have the mathematicians be an autonomous discipline, that they can explore this geometry, that geometry, whatever geometry, and of course they've got one eye on how it might be used. But that it can be used is not their department. It's the job of the physicists, the astrophysicists, whatnot. And even the physical geometry can be set up in different ways. That was Poincaré's point, although it got muddled with the issue of simplicity and his discussions with Einstein. By choosing different methods of measurement, what it takes to turn a pure geometry into a physical geometry is some method of measurement. And that can be set up in different ways, which yield different physical theories. And Poincaré's point, which is not quite correct, or at least it was not quite proven by the argument he gave, is that you can always save Euclidean geometry by messing up things with the method of measurement. Carnap gives such an argument that at least Einsteinian geometry, with its four-dimensional manifold of non-constant curvature, can be turned into a Euclidean the geometrical structure can be turned Euclidean in the way that he describes in the late philosophy of science textbook. So I can't see anything in what you say that I would want to disagree with, or I think that Carnap would want to disagree with. But I think what he actually does is much closer to saying, look, here's an autonomous discipline. For Menger, it would be set theory. For Hilbert, it would be geometry or mathematics. And they can make lots of different choices, and then we can apply it in various different ways. Carnap being most concerned with the analogy with logic, because the 34 book is a book about logic and not strictly speaking about geometry. So I'm not sure whether that helps or not, but it's probably the best I can do.
No, it was a good discussion. I mean, because I fully agree with your point that he meets a lot of Hilbert in Vienna and not only in the obvious fields, because Hahn and Frank have been there at Göttingen for a while each.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the third question, Jerry, is your third.
Thank you very much. Very curious and interesting presentation. My curiosity here in this context resides with regard to the notational conventions that Carnap may have addressed or not addressed, I don't know. The particular part is the convention of forming pairs as part of logical syntax, and the role of this pairing relationships that arise in the logic of the sciences. And in more particularly, his adoption, or his following, I should say, of Russell's notion of atomic sentences and molecular sentences lead to tensions among the sciences on the meaning of these terms. And this in turn is reflected in the notations that were adopted. And so my question then comes to, did Carnap discuss the role of notations in the relationship among the unity of the sciences, or was that foreign to his psychological point of view?
And the answer is,
Please change the mind. Turn off the mind.
there are, let me see if, no, there's not something with my mic. But the difference of notation certainly arises in the case of tolerance, because the cases that one thinks of, well, if you've got a different method of measurement, the choice between metric system and the English system of weights and measures, that sort of thing, they are notational variants of one another. That is to say, they can be translated back and forth, not always easily, but they can be translated back and forth in a truth-preserving way. That's not always the truth in the kinds of differences among systems that I pointed to as between language 1 and language 2 of logical syntax, and between certain metaphysical claims, say the differences between so-called Platonistic mathematics and so-called nominalistic or constructive mathematics. But there are enormous notational differences, say, between Frege's presentation of elementary logic and Russell's, and those have a great deal to do with how easily they can be used. So there are pragmatic differences even in things that have translations back and forth. But I don't see that this is particularly applied to the unity of science in anything I've read about, but perhaps you can help me out.
I was thinking more of the exactness or preciseness of the relationship between atomic sentences and molecular sentences as it extends into the other sciences. And here particularly, obviously, chemistry, and of course in the modern world, molecular biology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the issue here is more to the unity of the sciences as a consequence of the scientific notational differences that lead to the logical tensions. Is that clear? I'm just trying to clarify my question.
Well, I can see that there are differences in notation and what would count as a molecular sentence or an elementary sentence. If you've got for even in an extraordinarily simple case, calling something a square is to attribute a monadic predicate to it. If you analyze square into being four-sided and equilateral and meeting in right angle, that would turn out to be a molecular sentence rather than an atomic one. I'm not sure that that would have been seen as threatening the unity of science, although the unity of the word unity has a life of its own. The vogue a few years ago for the disunity of science seems to have very little to do with what Carnap was talking about, at least. If there was one thing that they were talking about, it seemed likely that there were many. But even at the time, von Neumann at one point thought that the separation into object and meta level languages threatened the unity of science. I don't think it threatens what Carnap is talking about, but yes, notational matters, division into object and meta level claims superficial differences between the sciences, which Carnap is perfectly happy to agree. At one point in physical language, he says, look, sciences are very heterogeneous. There are all kinds of things. Experimental physics looks very different from theoretical physics. It's just a day-to-day process. So notational differences could well have threatened some people's notion of the unity of science. I don't think they would have threatened Carnap's as I understand it. But I'm here to be corrected.
Okay, next is Katerina. Please,
Can you hear
Katerina.
me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thanks. Wait. So thank you very much, Rick. I have an observation and maybe a question. At the end of the talk, I had the idea that one might see in the Aufbau a tension between analysis and construction, I guess. Because you highlighted in the part related to tolerance, the logical paradigm of construction, telling the difference between construction and analysis. And I think this is important because even in order to defeat some of the classical objections against the Aufbau, it is useful to stress the logical paradigm of construction instead of that of analysis. But I think that the strong interpretation you gave to this reciprocal containment thesis, that I think you stick to the Aufbau there. Don't we think that this strong interpretation of reciprocal containment might subscribe to a logical paradigm of analysis instead of that of construction? If I say that all the physical truths are translatable into auto-psychological, I see here that one may shift from a paradigm of logical construction and logical analysis. Yeah, sorry for the clarification.
Okay, as I'm seeing, I'm talking about construction all along. And this is supposed to yield intersubjective concepts that one can correlate between the levels. And so it allows translation. Now, on a given construction, there's a fact of the matter about what something is constructed out of. But if one allows alternative constructions, then you've got something that looks, well, got one part of tolerance. Maybe it's a small part, maybe it's a large part. So there is the contrast I want to draw between analysis and construction. Now, if you have a constructed item, simply reversing the process is an analysis in a way. But if you think of what is constructed as merely a structure, then it doesn't make too much difference what it's constructed out of. Does that help? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I've fully understood the worry you've got, but as far as I can tell, despite Carnap's word, and he's simply borrowing this from Russell and Moore and people like that, the British analysts, even though he talks about analysis, what he's really doing is construction.
Thanks.
Okay.
Well, Luca, please.
Thank you. So thank you, Rick, for this interesting lecture. I have a couple of questions which are, I hope, short. The first one comes from what you said about the content of logic. This is something that you said that Carnap takes from Wittgenstein, that logical contents essentially are empty because logic is purely formal. This can be traced back to Kant. The introduction of a critical pure reason, Kant says the same thing, that logical thinking is purely formal, therefore ignores the content and so on. I've always been puzzled by this claim of Kant, because actually even syllogistic logic, you don't derive the square of opposition without considering the content, so you need to quantify over the content, because even for instance, the square of opposition quantifies over the content of the propositions in a quite precise manner. So I wonder whether what you mean when you say that for Carnap, following Wittgenstein, logic has no content whatsoever. That's my first question. Neo-Kantians, for instance, believe that, for instance, in instances of Richard, very clearly he claims that logic has a content, which is a formal content, but still has a content, for instance. Anyway, so my second question is more general and implies your view of the principle of tolerance of Carnap, because, as you know, in US there are many epistemologists that adopts and talk about a notion that derives from Carnap, but they are not Carnap scholars. So especially social epistemologists, they use the principle of tolerance quite often. My question is, what do you see are the limits, the boundaries of tolerance? So what are the conditions of the principle of tolerance that if they are denied, the tolerance simply doesn't hold anymore?
Okay, maybe here, let's see. Okay, let's first go to content for logic. I don't think that Wittgenstein ever gave anything that could be called a proof of anything. I mean, it seems more like a pronouncement than anything else. But from the point of view of the Viennese, Carnap included, it looked like it was going to be handy. This kind of distinction goes way back. And in Carnap's hands, it's very clearly or becomes, once he makes the meta-mathematical switch, a linguistic point. You can set up the language any way you like. Now, what gets said in it is a different matter. So the limits of tolerance are, it's not as though you can say anything you like about any subject you like. And insofar as you are allowed to say anything you like, what you have said adds nothing. In a way, Frege and Hilbert had this debate. Their discussions were pretty nasty, I have to admit, but Frege was afraid that, well, you can make God exist by laying down an axiom. The axiom's pretty empty. When you just lay down an axiom, it doesn't say anything about the world, is the claim. And so when the passage that I gave in discussing this, I put it into a vocabulary that Carnap might have accepted later, but he was not in a position to talk about it then, nor was Wittgenstein very much. To lay down a principle, claim that it doesn't need any justification, is not to tell you anything about the world. Indeed, in laying it down as such, it has no connection to the world at all. It does not pick out, and he wanted to claim that logic doesn't pick out one world from among others. It doesn't tell us what this world is like because it doesn't say anything, because the only thing that says anything is something that distinguishes this world from another. And so if there are a bunch of possible worlds and what you have said doesn't pick out any of them, because it's true in all possible worlds, then it's not descriptive. It has no content. Now, sometimes Carnap says it has no content. Sometimes he says it has no empirical content. And so, and the later you go in his career, the more often he talks about empirical content rather than content, but those come to pretty much the same thing for him. So that, what does a theory say? Well, it turns out that given the Carnap sentence as a meaning postulate, the one that the Ramsey of TC, horseshoe TC, that's going to turn out to make Ramsey of TC logically equivalent to TC. And so the theory says no more than its empirical content. But the Carnap sentence then doesn't say anything. It is the meaning component, but it doesn't say anything about this world. It doesn't pick out anything, and it claims that the theory itself doesn't pick out anything more. So if you take a logical sentence and make a Ramsey sentence out of it, it will turn out to be utterly empty as well. It will have no empirical content.
So you mean it does not have a factual content? That
right.
is how.
This is why, in some ways, I was happy to phrase it, there's no fact of the matter. You look at that introduction to logical syntax again. What he says is the most important message of the book is to fight the idea that there is one of these logics that's the correct one. And now, one might be useful. I mean, choose whichever one you want, and you're free to do so, but philosophers certainly cannot prohibit you from doing that. It is, if you like, a prohibition on prohibitions. And I think that's the take-home message that he wants for the book. So it gives you both the limits of no content, and it tells you something about the limits of tolerance as well, I think. Does that help answer the question? Now, it's very hard for realists like Russell and Wittgenstein, Russell and Frege, to think that there's no content in logic. Oh, the content is for all x equals x. Well, that's the important content that says that everything is identical to itself. Have you really said anything? I mean, what's the factual content of this? And if you don't just repeat that as the factual content, which is unhelpful, I think, it doesn't settle the question, then you're not ever going to be able to answer that question. So if you think that logic has content, it doesn't by itself have any empirical content. And Quine wanted to erase the distinction, if you like, between pure logic and other sorts of things, and say, well, logic can be tested like everything else, but it has to be done in the context of everything else we believe. And whether his alternative is viable or not, people don't worry about that too much. They ought to, because there's some considerable difficulties in making that work, I think. But I'm not sure whether that helps. Okay.
it does clarify. So thank you.
Okay.
So now there was Gödel, Thomas Gödel, that raised his hand before. So
Yes, thank you very much.
okay, please.
Thank you, Rick, for this very rich talk, and also for remembering Michael Friedman at the very beginning. I agree with you that he is being very much missed. But in your talk, I mean, you raise quite an amazing vista of, if I may put it like this. I mean, if the Aufbau wasn't complex enough, it's becoming even complexer now, more complex now, in trying to see the Aufbau within the context of the project of the Aufbau. So, so that's a wonderful kind of homework that you've left for all of us, trying to figure out precisely how things work out. So, but my question is far more detailed now. It really goes back to an old puzzle of mine, which maybe I shouldn't be puzzled about it at all. But you mentioned that, I mean, a puzzle I had about the Aufbau. You mentioned that already in the Aufbau, Carnap pays a lot of attention to intersubjectivity, and that's certainly true. I mean, he spends most of the 140s on reconstructing intersubjectivity after he in various ways, but it seems to me that that's not the only place that he addresses it. Much earlier in the book, in 66, he speaks of he speaks of what sounds to me like intersubjectivity, in as much as he says that the possibility of science is somewhat results, or not results, presupposes that there exists an analogous structure between the various streams of experience of the people who are engaged in science. So that seems to me to suggest that he's saying, well, intersubjectivity has a kind of a basis, in effect, of presupposition that really the kind of structure that I am here, so to speak, that I'm reconstructing here in the Aufbau, can also be reconstructed for other people, just like that they too, from the inside, sort of build up the world like that. And now, what puzzled me in many ways is that how to bring this into agreement with what he says about reconstruction of intersubjectivity he gives later, because there he kind of, well, in a way, it seems to me he just shows how it's possible to simulate intersubjectivity on an auto psychological base. Namely, I can reconstruct other people, so to speak, always on the basis of my mind that I so to speak, I reconstruct them, so to speak, in my image, to use a phrase of Putnam's. The intersubjectivity that's constructed in the 140s is one where I engage with other people as I imagine them to be in my mind, but it's clearly not, given he's on the auto psychological base. It's clearly not an intersubjectivity and interaction between two, allow me to say, real people, two separate people. And I was often wondering, well, given what he says in paragraph 66 about the need of an analogous, so to speak, base, psychological base in different people, the need for that, for intersubjectivity, and how he reconstructs it later, what precisely the relation is between them. Does he is he maybe suggesting that if indeed there is an analogous sort of structure between these different streams of experience of the various people engaging in science, then precisely the kind of reconstruction that he gives later on in the book, which proceeds on the auto-psychological base, is enough, because then, so to speak, there will be a match between my reconstruction of this imagined other and what other people, they also reconstruct the imagined me on their basis. But given there is this analogous sort of structure of the streams of experience, that kind of works. So he doesn't require some kind of pre-established harmony. I don't know whether that makes any sense, but I thought since you took us so far into the Aufbau, maybe I'll ask you this.
Well, one of the things that I learned from Michael and Alan was that there is a way of getting intersubjectivity even at the most basic level. Now, that's surprising because I'm the only one who has my experience. And so how can I build up some sort of structure that would be genuinely intersubjective, since the base elements, the element, their legs, are not intersubjective? The answer that I understand them to have given was, what we need is a logical structure built up on a subjective basis. But the logical structure is one that you could build up on your subjective basis. Then if we identify the concepts with that logical structure, and by the way, the logical structure is supposed to be give a definite description, the only concept that such and such. I mean, the visual field is the only 5-dimensional array that we can build there, and some sense modalities will have 3 dimensions or whatever else. But the idea is to get a definite structural description. Identify the concept with that. Now there is no, and so if you like, what was the base level no longer matters. And so we've got something, even at the autopsychological level, that is completely intersubjective. And now that same requirement is going to be for structural definite descriptions all the way up. So in that sense, we've got intersubjectivity all the way up. But Carnap does say, as you point out, yeah, but this is there are no, it's my reconstruction of other people rather than other people. But that seems to suggest that he's that phrasing is one nod too far, as I'm concerned, toward the idea that only the base objects are real. But because he's worried about concepts all the way up, I'm going to play the same game, but in the opposite direction. Since the base level are intersubjective, I want to claim that all the others are intersubjective. But my argument depended not on, because I think the notion of intersubjective is a little bit slippery here. I want to claim that people have intersubjective access to other minds. And it certainly sounds as though that construction from level 2 to level 3 is giving us that. And if you've got that, and one of those minds constructed at 3 out of a particular body at level 2 corresponds to mine, to the details of my sensory and cognitive life, then if we can identify, because we can correlate them in a non-accidental way, we can have, everybody else can have intersubjective access to my mind as well, just as I can have intersubjective access to theirs. That way you get the translation. But it doesn't, but it may be that I don't have direct intersubjective access. So everything is going to hinge on whether we're demanding for, in the physical language paper, in the physicalism stuff, whether we're demanding for science direct intersubjective access to everything we're talking about, or just merely intersubjective access. I think an argument can be made, it's a practical argument, which gives Carnap the conclusion he wants, that science really does need to be able to look at its own evidence. And so that evidence needs to be public. So there is a good reason for constructing something under which the base level is physical rather than autopsychological. You get all, in a sense, you get intersubjective access, but you don't get direct intersubjective access. And direct intersubjective access to your evidence would mean that we can all scrutinize the evidence we have in a way that we can't on the sort of Robinson Crusoe picture that is the official one in the Aufbau. Does that help address? I mean, it doesn't fully answer, I think, but and there are passages that I don't know what to do with in the Aufbau.
Yeah. No, this is
even Carnap is confused at times. I mean, he certainly confused me.
Well, probably all of us. That's true. Well, that's very helpful.
I'm more easily confused than he is. So
No, thank you. That's very helpful. Except one thing which shows you that probably I'm even more confused. Probably are more confused than you. Namely, if you could say just something about the difference between what you call direct access and indirect access to intersubjectivity. Is it you don't mean between as it were experiential intersubjectivity and reconstructed intersubjectivity? But so I'm not quite sure what you mean.
Well, this is going to take us into sort of contemporary philosophy of science, or Carnap's later philosophy of science. I worry about what makes something observational. And Carnap doesn't want to say. What he wants to say, what he does say is, well, you can make a decision about it after a few observations, which does not help say too much about what observation is. But I'm inclined toward looking at what the rules of the game are. And the rules of the game can be set up in lots of different ways. And the rules of the game can be set up so that non-inferential reports count as justified or acceptable if those reports are made about physical objects, middle-sized physical objects held at arm's length under suitable conditions and so on, and not allow certain others. I don't care what happens on the Ouija board. It's not evidence as far as I'm concerned. Empathy is a good thing. It's not evidence. Insight is a good thing. It's not evidence. Now, are we going to allow first-person reports as evidence? Well, I can imagine playing out in different ways. I can imagine someone thinking that, well, the only evidence is first-person reports. That looks sort of like the construction. If you think of this as reconstructing the evidential pathways, wherever the most basic elements are is going to be your basic evidence. And I think that is a large part of what Carnap is doing in the Aufbau. So I'm going to say direct is non-inferential. so that there are some things we can tell by looking or tasting or touching. We don't infer it. Now,
Okay.
Descartes thinks that the only thing I can observe is the contents of my own mind, and I have to go through this elaborate inference to get out to there's an apple in my hand.
All right.
I think that deserves to be, that we set up the rules in such a way that that's direct. I can directly judge and justifiably that there's an apple in my hand. Does that help the non-inferentialness of?
Yeah, no, that helps. That's very good. So in other words, if I get it right, then for Carnap would, on this account, hold it to be sufficient for his project of reconstructing understanding science, if he can provide with the tools he has in the Aufbau an account of how we all have indirect access to the intersubjectivity of our interactions.
Yeah, I think we can get
sort of inferential access.
Yes, but we cannot. I think it's better for science, and I think this is the conclusion he comes to, is that it's better for science if we have even all of the direct evidence, the non-inferential evidence, be out there in the public where everybody can look at it. And that is a change.
That's at the base level. Yeah.
The events in question are subjective in the sense of we have no intersubjective access, but we don't have, I'm agreeing, but we don't have direct, which is why I said everything is going to hinge for that intersubjectivity argument on exactly how the demands are phrased. If you're demanding everything have intersubjective access, that's not going to get you to physicalism in the sense of the physical language being the only language in which that's the case. But if you want to say, we've got to make sure that all of the direct evidence is public, and I think that's ultimately who he comes down to, then yeah, I can well imagine that the physical language is going to be required to do that.
Great, thank you.
I'm happy with where he gets to. I'm just not sure exactly how to deploy this idea of intersubjectivity to get there. I mean, just in waving the flag isn't enough.
Thank you. That's great.
So the time is up. So more than 2 hours that we are here together. So I would thank you again, warmly thank you again, Richard Creath, for his generous and very, very interesting contribution to this seminar. So I will thank you also, all of you, for being here. And I remember that the seminar continues, and the next meeting will be the 21st of May, and Thomas Hubel will be the speaker of that seminar on Carnap. On Carnap, was he completely confused when he remembered the Aufbau in the 50s about the confusion again of Carnap and maybe Howard as well. So just to thank you and say goodbye.
Thanks. I will send an email with some information. I am opening a YouTube channel where your talks will be available. So I will let you know as soon as the channel is ready, okay?
And thank you to everybody. If there are other questions, just send me an email.
Great.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Bye all. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Now, Katerina, is there anything I need to do? Is there anything I need to do to sign off or anything for you?
Sorry,
No,
Rick, I don't
No,
understand.
nothing. I think we are fine like we are.
We can.
Rick, thank you so much. It was extremely interesting for me, and maybe, I mean, I can write you a message in case I have other questions that I am still thinking about. Okay. Was
Thank
great.
you, Rick. It was a very interesting and.
Lucas, I've heard a small part of this before.
So again.
You've heard a small part of this before in Hartford.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where?
At the SHAP meeting in Hartford.
I didn't know. Okay. I attended the talk you gave at SHAP online, but it was very much on anti-metaphysics and verificationism, as I remember. About what implies what.
So, but the SHAP meeting last year was in person at Hartford. And
yeah, it was two places actually, Hartford and
Wesleyan.
Wesleyan, right? Correct. It's correct. Yes. Yeah. Are you going to Vienna this year?
Alas, no, because like the time we had it in Berlin, I have another meeting that's exactly at the same time, and since a colleague is organizing that one, I really have to be there to support my colleague. And that one's in Portugal. And I mean, unless I were a beam of light, I couldn't get there in time to really participate. I mean, Lisbon is closer, but it's still, if I go to the one meeting, it's in Porto. If I go to the one meeting in Porto, there's just not a possibility to get to.
Yeah, Porto is wonderful. I just stopped a couple of times. I think it's amazing.
I've never been there. I've never been to Portugal at all. So
I flew through. I didn't stop. But I mean, the airport was very interesting. So, well, okay. So I will not see you in Vienna this year. Maybe I will meet you later somewhere else. Are you going to the APA now?
What?
Are you going to San Francisco now? To the APA?